Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Today, we have Mack Ross, a professor from Western University, to talk to us about the higher education in Canada. Mack, it's an honor to have you here. I know personally that you've studied at 3 or 4 universities and you've taught at uh, 2 or 3 Canadian and American universities. So it's a quite well interesting experience. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's really exciting.
So today we will talk about, the higher education, some of the expectations. We'll talk about, the postgraduate and how could people, make their decisions. A lot of people are asking about, process, admission, stuff like that. So if you could please give us just some kind of a hint, tips, that would be highly appreciated, sir.
Sure. I'm Mack Ross. I'm an assistant professor at Western University. I teach in kinesiology, but my education is mostly in history, actually. So I teach the history of sport here at Western. I've taught at a few different schools. I've taught at Western University, which is a very big school, as we all know, with over 30,000 students. I've taught at kind of a medium size or mid-sized school, St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. And then I've taught at a very small school with under 1,000 students called Keystone College in the United States in Pennsylvania. So I've seen some interesting things and noticed a lot of differences between the various types of education you can pursue at the post-secondary level, whether here in Canada or in the United States. I also attended 3 universities and got my degrees at different schools. So I did my BA in history at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, my Master's of History at St. Mary's University in Halifax, which is a little bit bigger than Mount Allison again, and then came to the really big school, Western, to do my PhD, which is often the case. Now, I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Oops. Okay. Perfect. And okay, so can you see that okay? I think so.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, so when you're trying to pick out what kind of post-secondary institution, excuse me, you may like to attend here in Canada, it's important to take a look at your priorities. A lot of people know what they want to do, but there's other things to take into consideration other than just the topic area that you might be focused on. So you might want to consider the research profile of the university if research is something you're really interested and passionate about. Class size is something else that I've found to be very important. At Western, we have some very big classes. It was really nice at some of the other schools that were smaller, maybe 5,000 and under in terms of the total student population, that you could have 30 people in a class or so and really get to know the students really get to know you. And I think it makes for a nice learning environment. But at the same time, you're not going to necessarily get exposed to the same caliber of researcher that you would at a school like Western or U of T or McGill, where they have a lot of research activity going on. So sometimes you want to look for quality with flexibility, and we have those schools in Canada as well. So really in Canada, we categorize our schools in 3 main ways. There's the primarily undergraduate schools, so like Mount Allison University, where I went to school for my undergraduate degree. They tend to be quite a bit smaller. The student body there is only 2,300, almost 2,800 students And they don't have a huge amount of programs. So that can be a limiting factor. They may not have the program you want. So they have 48 programs. They have kind of what we would call the meat and potatoes, I guess, of education, all the main ones like history, math, biology, chemistry, economics, the big ones. They don't have a ton of the newer, more interdisciplinary programs that you might find at some of the bigger schools. And they don't have much in terms of graduate education. So they might have 1 or 2 graduate degrees, usually at the master's level, but that's about it. I think there's only about 15 graduate students at Mount Allison right now. Then kind of the next size up, and with a more diversity of offerings, are the comprehensive schools, like Simon Fraser University. And I picked these schools because for various reasons, Maclean's magazine rates them as the top school in each category. There's not a lot of difference. One thing I wanted to say here about Canada, there's not a big difference between the schools here, the way there is in some other nations. The United States, for example, the gap between the very best schools and the very worst schools is very large, and very obvious when you visit. That's not the case in Canada. You can go to any publicly funded university in Canada and get an excellent education. And I don't think anybody would view a degree, any differently, maybe outside of a few disciplines, regardless what university you got it from in Canada. If you went to university, you went to university. So Simon Fraser is a little bit bigger. It has more graduate programs. It has more programs overall. The class sizes have to be bigger. They have 30,000 students, similar to Western. But they're not a doctoral university necessarily. They're a little bit smaller than that. And that's where the Westerns and the McGills and the Torontos come in. They have the highest level of research activity. They have many PhD programs. They have many undergraduate programs. McGill has over 300. And the student body is very large. So your introductory courses at those schools, like Western, I teach an introductory course here now. They're 400 to 500, sometimes even more. So if that's not something you think that you or perhaps your child would be comfortable with, I know I wouldn't have been able to learn very well in that environment as an undergraduate. I needed smaller class sizes. I came from a village of 800 people. So in some of these classes at Western, you could literally fit my village in there. But other people don't have that same challenge. They come from bigger high schools. They come from cities, not villages like me. So they're able to make the adjustment to universities that are quite a bit bigger, a lot easier. But just for an example, I'm going to use Western because that's what I'm most familiar with. To look at the admissions process when you're trying to get into university. So for Ontario high school students, every single province is a little bit different when it comes to how they organize their high school courses. But here in Ontario, it's pretty standardized. So you have to have 6 grade 12 university preparatory courses, or the university/college preparatory courses, which are an M on the catalog, to get in, and you have to have all your grade 11s either completed or in progress. The one course you have to have for every single program on campus is English for University, which makes sense. It's kind of the foundation for everything we do here. But just to show you that it can be quite a bit different, in Nova Scotia, where I come from, things are much less, structured when it comes to the courses you have to take, and the labeling of courses with various letters and things like that. So if you were to come here from Nova Scotia and go to Western, you'd have to have 5 what they consider to be acceptable grade 12 courses. And that's the term they use. So there's some subjectivity there. It's not as clear. It's not as clear cut. But they do want you to have that grade 12 English again. For international high school students, it's much more fluid because the education systems around the world vary a lot. But one thing you will have to have is proof of English proficiency if it's not your first language. And then your high school diploma just has to be accredited by whichever body is widely accepted to be the authority for that in the nation that you're coming from. Then on top of all that, there are specific program requirements. I just picked out a few. So kinesiology, the department I teach in, we require biology. Engineering you'd have to come in and have advanced functions, calculus, and vectors, chemistry, physics. And if you wanted to go into management and organizational studies, you'd need 2 of advanced functions, calculus and vectors, and math and data management. And it's different all across the board. Different departments require different things depending on what you need to excel. Some of the arts and humanities or social sciences across Canada may require more English, more written type courses, whereas most of the sciences are going to have some kind of math, chemistry, physics, biology, things like that. So one of the questions that often comes up is who is domestic and who is international? And this matters in a big way because it's a big deal for tuition. So you're an international student here in Ontario if you are a refugee or on a visa. Now, refugees typically become permanent residents very quickly, so that's not an issue for very long. Citizens and permanent residents are considered domestic students. And the reason that's so important is because of the cost. Now, the cost varies because we have at least a partially socialized system of education in Canada. So part of it is subsidized by the government. And it varies by provincial government because it falls under the responsibilities of the provincial governments in their jurisdiction. So if you're going to pay domestic tuition to come here to Western, it's 6,000 to 12,000 depending on which program you're going to choose, and that's per year. Now, if you're an international student, that could be anywhere from 35,000 to 54,000 a year. And having taught in the United States at a private institution and being aware of what other private institutions charge that didn't have the same subsidies as some of the public institutions down there, I can tell you that's kind of right on what it would cost if you were to strip it away down there as well. There we go. So to get in, one of the biggest questions I get as a professor from anybody who meets me is what average do I have to have in high school to get into Western or whatever other schools. I get a lot of questions about Nova Scotia schools and maritime schools as well. There's a handful of schools that have really, really high standards in terms of their admittance. Manitoba, Waterloo, Western, Queens, McMaster, Victoria, Toronto, and McGill all have over 90%. They don't require you to have 90% to get in on paper. So when you go and look online, they'll say the minimum average is 75 or 80 or whatever it may be. But what happens is as students apply, that average goes up. So if a lot of students apply with 90s, all of a sudden the average to get in isn't really 75 or 80, it's 90%. And unfortunately, it's getting far more difficult to discern who really is a kind of an A+ student and who isn't, because one of the side effects of the pandemic has been grade inflation, because we've been struggling to find ways to assess students in remote settings and things like that. So we're going to have some of the highest averages ever recorded coming in the next couple of years. And it'll be up to us to try to determine what makes each student special, what makes student A different from student B, Maybe we'll have to introduce more of an interview and survey process than we've had in the past. But something's going to have to change, and it'll change across the board because this is not just an Ontario issue. I broke these all down based on three percentage point increments. So you can see down at the 82 to 85% range, Lethbridge, Windsor, Ontario Tech. Those are all excellent schools. So don't let the percentages fool you. Windsor is an excellent school. It gets a bad reputation. I think in part because some people just don't really have an affection for Windsor necessarily. But it is a good school with very good programs, good professors. And all the other schools in between are also excellent. So there's not a single school, for example, that I would look at and, say my children who are only 6 and 18 months, once it's time for them to pick a school, there's no school on this list at all that I would say, no, don't go there. They're all excellent schools. We're very lucky in Canada. And we're very, very lucky that we haven't seen the surge in private institutions that we've seen in the United States. So I taught in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has way more universities and colleges than they could ever possibly fill properly, which leads to kind of competition between the schools for students, and it also lowers the standards for admission. And because there's so many universities and colleges with low enrollment, they don't have much money. And when you lower the enrollment, you are going to end up having to take in students with lower GPAs coming in. Maybe instead of 70, you take 65 or 60. And the problem is, once they get to that level, and the schools don't have any money, they can't put any funding into supporting students with 60s or 65s to make the transition to university or college. I'm not saying that I think that they shouldn't be able to go to university or college. I think they absolutely should be. I think there should be more diversity in our recruitment of students, and less emphasis put on grades, because there are socioeconomic factors that inevitably impact what a person's grades will be. For example, you can't really have super high grades if one of your parents is sick and you have to be the one to go out and supplement the family income. If that's the case, then a 65 is pretty good. But if you don't get the opportunity to explain that to somebody at the admissions office, no one's ever going to know, and you're not going to get in. So when you have those kinds of grades coming in, it's important that there's support systems. And with the way the private college industry has unfolded in the States, they don't have that necessarily at some of the struggling colleges and universities. And we don't have to worry about that here. We had a bit of a scare with Laurentian University in the last couple of years, but it seems like they're going to settle down, and things are going to shake out okay up there. Cape Breton University's had some struggles in the past, but they seem to be coming around again. So like I said, no school on here that I would not send my own children to. It's just a matter of preference, what kind of education you want, what kind of campus you want. There are some rural campuses that maybe, folks from cities aren't super comfortable going to, or just don't want to go to. I know I had friends at Mount Allison that found it very boring because we were in the middle of nowhere beside a marsh, and they were used to Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal. Whereas for me, it was a relatively big, exciting place. We are lucky to have a lot of public colleges as well. Here in Canada, colleges and universities are very different from each other. In the States, they're not necessarily that way. You can find any number of institutions that are called a college for marketing purposes, but really by Canadian standards would be a university. Like Dartmouth, for example, is a university, but because they call themselves college for so long, they would never change that, of course. Here, it's very different. There is some overlap, which I'll explain. But even then, the overlaps that exist, for example, both can offer bachelor's degrees. They offer different types of education that it's important to be aware of, because if you take their bachelor's or the university bachelor's, you're going to get a very different experience. So in Ontario, we have 27 public colleges, just public colleges alone, not counting the private career colleges that we have. And in Canada, there's 210 from coast to coast. London has a really, really good college, Fanshawe College, which offers everything from undergraduate degrees to college certificates and graduate diplomas. So the undergraduate degrees, there's not a whole bunch. There's only maybe 8 to 10. They have things like commerce, finance, interior design, nursing, psychology. Like many colleges, there's a lot of emphasis on business. There's a lot of emphasis on healthcare when it comes to developing undergraduate degrees. College diplomas are typically shorter than undergraduate degrees, but they will get you into industry quicker. They're very practical. So things like business, hospitality, culinary, social services, welding. There's lots and lots and lots of options. And in some cases, you can transfer to an undergraduate program at a university if that's what you want to do. Most of the colleges have some kind of articulation agreement with the local universities. Here it's Western and our affiliated campuses. And then you can do certificates, which are usually under a year. So like business fundamentals, auto body, culinary skills, which is different than like a full Red Seal cook type situation. The Red Seal is they're recognized trades that are very regulated, have apprenticeships, things like that, that are typically taught through our colleges. General arts, things like that. Now, like I said, sometimes you will find degrees that are very similar between, say, Fanshawe and Western. It's not uncommon in other parts of the country either. So the big and most interesting example of this for me is the psychology departments at each school here in London. Psychology at Fanshawe is very hands-on, very out in the industry, experiencing it, learning on the job. They of course have courses. You have lots of courses, but you also have 420 hours of practicum and 420 hours of internship. So you're getting experience regularly. Almost 2 whole years are spent out in the workforce. That is not the case at Western. And I wanted to make sure, so I checked with one of my colleagues. Western is heavily course-based, very academic, very, book-based, learning in the classroom, but it does have some community engagement opportunities in the upper years for their psych program. And that's normally through developing projects for local community members who need assistance in the realm of psychology. But it's nowhere near as extensive in terms of the experiential learning component as Fanshawe is. So if you're a person who really learns by doing, and you're interested in psychology and you live in London or near London, you have an ideal situation where you can make the choice to come to Western and do a more academic classroom-based program, but you also have this excellent program at Fanshawe College that might be right up your alley, where you can actually get in there and experience the job in a very thorough way and get the exact same degree. So you're still going to get an honors undergraduate bachelor's in psychology, just like you would from us at Western. It's just a completely different way of learning. And that's what's so important about having the colleges and the universities, because I'll be the first one to tell you that the university is very traditional in many respects when it comes to experiential learning. Yeah, we'll get you into labs, we'll get you those kinds of opportunities. We have more practicums than we used to, and we have internship opportunities, but nothing that is even remotely close to the breadth that is offered by Fanshawe College in terms of going out into the workforce and learning like that. Now, there are other colleges close by. Lambton College is over in Sarnia, and St. Clair College is just down in Windsor. So there are other options other than Fanshawe. And then, of course, since the pandemic, there's all kinds of options when it comes to online learning. So I'm looking to learn Arabic, and I was able to pretty quickly figure out that I could take online courses at Waterloo, Toronto, Seneca College. There's lots of options available now that were not available before. So that's really exciting. So just because a school isn't necessarily close by doesn't mean necessarily that you can't take their programs anymore. And again, we run into the same situation at Fanshawe and similar colleges when it comes to tuition. So it is far more expensive for an international student who is not a permanent resident or a citizen of Canada to take their programs. So for the addiction and mental health program, it's over 4 times as much. Same with aviation, maintenance, and if you're going to do the degree in behavioral psychology, it would be almost $74,000. So it's a similar situation to what we have at Western. It's not as inflated in terms of the difference between the international tuition and the domestic tuition. Is a little bit better, but not much better. Maybe 3 times instead of 4 times. So still a very daunting thing to have to get through. If you're coming to Canada as a refugee, it can be the education system can be very daunting, and we're lucky that the World University Service Council, I forget what that stands for, actually, my apologies, but the student refugee program that they offer is active in Canada. It started in Canada, I believe, and they help about 130 students a year to get into university or college and get settled in that very first year of being here. When they're sorting out their permanent residency, when they're getting settled with housing, all those kinds of things. And it's privately funded, but they are a charity, so they're able to generate enough money to do this. And they've been around since the 1980s or 1970s, so they have lots of experience. But the money they provide can be used for application fees, tuition, books, language training, prep courses, because sometimes individuals have to flee before they could possibly finish their high school, and can often have to make multiple stops along the way, so you don't get to re-enroll or anything like that. So you can get caught up, a monthly stipend for food allowance, and then often the universities will provide the tuition. So it'd be kind of an in-kind situation for that first year, and it's only for a year. So when you see those kind of misleading things on the internet, the really inflammatory posts on Facebook that say, well, why are we giving refugees free education when it's so hard for Canadians to pay for education? Well, that's not what's happening. And the Canadian government is not doing it either, which is often an argument you see online. That's not happening. It's through organizations like this. It's for a year. It's to help people get settled, help people get oriented, and help them restart their lives after a very traumatic experience. So after that first year and after you're a permanent resident, you can start to apply for all the typical Canadian funding. And it is quite robust. So there's the Canada Student Grant for full-time students, which is up to $6,000 a year. And it's determined based on the size of your family and your household income. So you can see here it varies dramatically. There's a low end and a high end, but if you fall under the low end, you're guaranteed to get it. So you don't have to worry almost at all. You're going to get the money. But if you fall in the middle somewhere, you'll probably get at least a partial grant. And there are other options. It's very similar, but for more specific circumstances. So the Canada Student Grant for full-time students with dependents is a little bit different. So if you have dependents who are under 12, or you have dependents who are over 12 and are individuals with a disability, you can get $3,200 per year per child, or at least up to that amount to help you. And that again is based on your income bracket. Then there's the part-time option, which kind of follows the same criteria and can pay up to $3,840 a year. But it's not per child, if I understand correctly. It's just a lump sum regardless. And that's again up to 38. You could potentially get less, but even if you did, there's lots of other options. So student loans obviously aren't ideal. It's not great to have something hanging over your head, as I know all too well. Still paying off my student loan, but sometimes if we're really passionate about something we want to do, you take a student loan to get that education so you can go and begin your career. So the amount will always depend on the province or territory that you're in, the level of income your family has, whether or not you have dependents, how much tuition is, living expenses, things like that. I'll go into a little more detail on a slide that's coming up. There's actually a calculator you can use to see how much you would get. It's not a perfect calculation, but it's pretty good. But there's also other opportunities. So if you wanted to go into the trades and go to Fanshawe College, for example, you can get a $4,000 loan called the apprentice loan. That's interest free for your period of technical training. There's also the apprenticeship incentive grant, which you don't have to pay back, which is nice, which is $1,000 a year up to $2,000. And most of these programs only take 2 years, or should only take 2 years. So $2,000 is all you would be maxed out at that point and be finished. The apprenticeship completion grant is another $2,000 per person, and that's paid out once you've actually gone through the process of becoming a journey person and are practicing your trade. The government will kick back a little bit more money at that point once you're out in the workforce to help you pay back the costs of your education. And then there's also the apprenticeship incentive grant for women, which is going to end in 2013. Well, it's a pilot, so it could end, it could continue, but we'll see. And that was another $3,000 per year, up to a maximum of $6,000. So quite a bit of help, especially because these programs, they often cost more than $6,000. So it was a really great initiative. I hope it got used enough that they would consider keeping it going. So I went through the process just to see what the calculator would generate for a couple different situations for student loans. So if you were a single student with no dependents in Ontario, living away from home, from a family of 4, with a household income of 100K, you would automatically get a grant of some amount, but probably around $1,800 that you don't have to pay back. And then you would get a loan of $11,900 or up to $11,900, which I believe is the max. So that's at the university level of if you're pursuing an undergraduate education. For a diploma or a certificate, you wouldn't get any grant, but you would get the exact same opportunity for a loan. And the reason the loans are up and above tuition is because they help you pay for your housing and things like that. Now, if you were a married student with 2 dependents, a family of 4, and a household income the same as above, you would get a much bigger grant, and your loan would stay the same. And you would also be able to get a grant for a diploma or a certification through a college. So it really depends on your situation, how much you'd be able to get. But everybody more or less would be able to find some sort of support, whether or not it's a loan you have to pay back or a grant that you don't have to pay back will depend on a whole lot of factors, including your income, what kind of program it is. The government of Ontario right now is really big on the apprenticeships and trade, so they're willing to chip in more for that. And the federal government is too, so it's a good time to go into that. And the university degrees are always, I'm a big fan of just learning to better oneself. That's initially all I really did. I thought I might be a school teacher and ended up being a professor. But I was really there because I loved what I was doing. And I was really interested in all the things I could learn at a university. Of course, I'm from a middle-class family, so I had an opportunity to go, and my parents were able to help me. But before I wrap this up, I wanted to say a few more things. So there are other institutions around that are not publicly funded, that are not, a publicly funded college or university. You want to be wary of those when you're considering enrollment. They'll try to sell you on kind of rapid education. You get your degree quicker, so you pay more for it. Quite often that also means you don't learn as much. And sometimes the instruction can be substandard. We had another issue in London, Ontario with the Everest colleges. There was 15 throughout Ontario, I think. And they all had to close, and all the students couldn't finish their degrees. I think a few schools helped out and picked them up, but a lot of people were left hanging. There's a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of lost money, and at the end of the day, they're a private for-profit entity. So once things start to go bad, they're just looking out for themselves. So keep that in mind anytime you see a for-profit institution here in Canada. There are a few around that are accredited, and they seem to be doing pretty well, but I would still caution everybody against enrolling at those institutions. There's also been a whole bunch of diploma mills that have got busted up, basically, that were giving out PhDs for lived experience and things like that. People were getting jobs, but then everybody caught on. So you're paying thousands of dollars for something that everybody's aware doesn't mean anything, which is obviously not great for the pocketbook or for your reputation or for your career. So whenever you're in doubt, I find if I go with my gut, if it feels weird and that the website doesn't look quite right, it often isn't quite right. There are institutions currently operating in Canada that are not accredited and are frequently getting in trouble. So it's important to pay attention to those and try to avoid them as best you can. In London, there are lots of reputable career colleges, but my honest advice would be if Fanshawe offers the same program, even if it takes another year, go do it at Fanshawe. It'll cost a fraction of the price. The instructors will be better. There's stability at Fanshawe that you're not going to get at the other places. So my main priority as an educator in the post-secondary industry is to make sure people are not taken advantage of and that they're getting the education they expect. So at the end of the day, if it's not listed by the government of Ontario, I try to avoid it and tell people to stay away. But that's it, and I'm happy to answer any other questions. I know there's a lot I didn't cover, including graduate education, which I'm happy to talk about, and med school applications, and anything you want. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mack, for this very informative presentation. We've got some questions, so we can just go on them, shortly, if you would like, before we wrap up. Yeah. So first, we've got those questions, some through the Facebook page or through the YouTube stream. So first question, is there any scholarships for the newcomers that could be applied for rather than for the international students, sorry, not for the newcomers. You already talked about the OSAP and the assistant program. Is there any scholarships that for the international students so they could apply for?
There are some. They're often department by department, school by school. Sometimes you can find scholarships through kind of local cultural organizations and things like that. But generally, there's not nearly as much as there is for the Canadian students, which obviously is counterintuitive because it costs so much more to come from abroad and go to school at a Canadian institution that it can be very cost prohibitive. So there are some opportunities, but not a ton.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for the doctorate program and the PhD program, is it all research based, or it's a course based, or it's a combination between those two?
So here in Canada, it's almost always going to be a combination. So, for example, if you went to the UK, you can often do a PhD that is just purely your research. And you're going to focus on your research the whole time you're there. You're not going to take courses. In Canada, we do normally a small amount of courses and then your dissertation. There are other doctorates throughout Canada and the United States and the UK too, that are more professional doctorates, that you would do more of a major research project at the end. And those are more intended to get you into professions and things like that. In the States, there's a lot more of those. So like doctorates of health administration, of doctorates of physiotherapy that are very different from our doctorates of physiotherapy. They're more professional degrees down there to meet the demand that comes with having a privatized healthcare system and having to compete with physicians for money from patients. So you want to have doctor on your door. We don't do that up here, which is kind of nice. But if you were going to, for example, go to the States, quite often there's a heavy course load in addition to the dissertation. So Canada is kind of a happy medium where we're kind of right down the middle, where you take some courses and do a dissertation. One nice thing that can happen if you've already done a master's, you can have courses knocked off of your PhD. So I think I had one or two knocked off because I had done quite a few courses in my master's that were relevant enough that they could count them here. So that's another option. So if you have some work already done, you can get it counted. But the other thing that happens is people take more courses than they need to just because they're interested. So we have that flexibility, which is nice.
I see. Thank you very much. So maybe you answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How you could know that the institution or the program is accredited? Is there any clear list, some place that with a search engine you can just put the name or the program so you could find?
Even Wikipedia will tell you now. Yeah, Wikipedia will say it's a public funded university in Ontario or any other province now. But you can also find it on the Ontario government website will tell you. There's the associations you can look at as well, particularly for the colleges, because those are a little bit more complicated to keep track of. There's a lot of private colleges that sound like they could be a public college. But there's the Association of Ontario Colleges, or publicly funded colleges, or something along those lines that you can find online that lists them all. So you can be very confident in it.
Yeah, and this is a great step before you start spending your money and time and effort, and doing correspondences. It's very helpful to be aware of what you are going to enroll yourself in, of course. So another two questions, if I may. One of them, that language might be an obstacle for an international student. Is there any conditional acceptance, or any language courses that the one could take before he or she enroll into a program, and how's that could work?
Sure. So quite often, you can get in with good grades and kind of middle of the road English, as long as you can pass the test. But after that, my advice to my own personal students is if you're finding it difficult to follow along, or it's hard enough to understand me sometimes because I do have a different way of speaking than a lot of people in Ontario just because I'm from the East Coast. So for example, I'll say things like, I live in a hose. Well, I mean house, but it just comes out funny. And so my kids make fun of me all the time for it, but that can be really confusing for somebody who's English second language. Um, so come and talk to me. I think most professors would be comfortable with that. And you can get assistance on campus through various programs that we have to help speed up the process and get you more comfortable learning in English, because that's also something different, right? But the most important thing is communication with professors. If your professor doesn't know, there's nothing they can do. And they often know off the top of their head where these services are, right? So if you can go to them and just be very honest, they'll often help you out and make sure that you can find the supports you need. There are all kinds of options when it comes to English as a second language throughout the city. Some of it's very, very affordable. Some of it's almost free. So the problem would be if you're trying to come from abroad and you're not going to be in the city in advance, then you'd have to find those supports wherever you're coming from, which could be more difficult.
Indeed. So, and last but not least, as you know, COVID affected the whole entire educational process, and actually it's affected our whole life. So do you think that institutions will go more forward into online education rather than the in-person?
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely trying to come up with flexible options at the very least, because we've realized that some students really took to online learning and hybrid learning styles, and other students didn't at all. Some students like to learn in person, and so one thing I know we're trying to do at Western is come up with hybrid delivery. So you could potentially be in a course where you can choose whether you want to be online or in person. You wouldn't be able to flip back and forth because we only have so many chairs in a classroom, and if we fill all those with in-person learners, we have to be confident that the folks online are going to stay online. But it would be a real advantage to be able to teach bigger groups of people with these hybrid models. So that's something we're working on right now. Some schools are further ahead than Western. And it's worth checking into those, because there are going to be places where you can do a whole really good degree online, where we're learning how to offer things online in a far more exciting way than we did at the start of the pandemic, which was not pretty. Now I think we're really starting to figure out what works and what absolutely did not work. And we're changing the way we view education too, where we're more focused on learning than we were before. We were so concerned about grades, I think, that we forgot that learning is really what we're here for. And whether it's in a classroom or online, you have to make sure that the information you're presenting is actually being absorbed and understood. And once we were faced with that challenge of online teaching, I think we realized that has to be a far more central component of what we're doing, instead of kind of the old traditional, you sink or you swim mentality, which I don't think any of us want to stay.
Indeed. Well, I think that would wrap up our session. Thank you very much, Mac, today for being here with us. and looking forward to host you again for another sessions with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Thank you very much, sir.
Of course, thank you.